All right, we're diving into this whole TSMC thing today. Got a ton of stuff to go through, articles, research papers, even some internal memos.
Sounds intense.
It is. It's a big deal. We got to figure out what this $100 billion investment really means.
Yeah, you don't see a company dropping that kind of cash every day, especially not on something as complex as building chip fabs in the US.
Exactly. Not your everyday business deal.
To really grasp how big this is, we have to remember TSMC basically runs the show when it comes to making those advanced semiconductors. You know, the tiny brains and everything, our phones, supercomputers, even like the most advanced AI.
And we're not talking just any chips, right? This is leading edge tech. Stuff that ends up in data centers, self-driving cars, even military gear.
Right on. What makes TSMC so dominant is their mastery of the manufacturing process. They're the ones pushing the limits with stuff like EUV lithography. That's the tech that lets them cram tons of tiny transistors onto these silicon wafers.
So smaller, more powerful chips, more energy efficient.
Exactly, and that's where the whole geopolitical thing comes in. The U.S. wants in on this, especially with China trying to catch up and build its own chip industry.
Makes sense, right? You suddenly realize most of the chips come from Asia, Taiwan specifically. And things with China, well, let's just say they're not always peachy.
It's like finding out the key to all your tech is held by, well, someone who might not have your best interests at heart.
Not a good feeling.
Nope. That's why the U.S. is making this move, bringing TSMC's production here onto American soil. They want to be less reliant on others and make sure they have a steady supply of those chips, especially for important things like defense.
National security, yeah.
Yeah.
Keeping the U.S. competitive, staying ahead in things like artificial intelligence. It's wild how something as tiny as a semiconductor can be at the center of all this global power play.
It really shows how crucial these semiconductors are to everything today. And when you think about the kinds of chips TSMC is making, it gets even more serious.
Oh, yeah.
The chips for AI systems. The ones used for things like intelligence analysis, surveillance, even autonomous weapons.
It's not just about having the latest gadget anymore. This is about having the upper hand in things that could affect global stability.
Exactly. TSMC's most advanced chips, those made using EUV, they're the brains behind some of the most powerful AI being developed right now. And the U.S. wants access to those brains. Bringing TSMC's factories here is how they plan to do it.
But it's not all smooth sailing, is it? There's a lot riding on this. And not just for the U.S. There's talk that this whole thing could cause problems with China.
Yeah, it's a real concern. China's been putting a lot of resources into building their own chip industry. They don't want to depend on companies like TSMC anymore, so this move by the U.S., well, they're probably going to see it as a direct challenge.
And we know China doesn't shy away from a little assertiveness when they feel threatened. What could they actually do to counter this?
They've got options. They could pump more money into their own chip makers, make it harder for TSMC to do business in China.
Maybe even put direct pressure on TSMC, right? Considering they're based in Taiwan, which China claims is their own. Talk about caught in the crossfire.
Definitely puts TSMC in a tough spot. They're trying to keep both the U.S. and China happy, but this might force them to pick a side.
And potentially lose a lot of business in one of the world's biggest markets.
It's a classic business dilemma, yeah.
This is way more than just a business deal. It's a high-stakes game of global chess.
With consequences that could impact the whole world's economy.
And then there's the whole ethics thing.
Oh,
We're
yeah.
talking about super powerful AI systems here, the kind that could change everything. Shouldn't we be thinking about the ethical side of all this?
We absolutely should. As AI gets more sophisticated and starts playing a bigger role in our lives, we need to talk about the ethics of it all.
Right, like what happens if those algorithms are biased? What about privacy? What about someone using this tech for the wrong reasons, like surveillance or even, autonomous weapons?
It's like giving a toddler a loaded gun and hoping for the best. We need some serious guidelines and regulations.
Exactly. But who makes those rules? Governments. Corporations. Is there even a way to enforce them globally?
Those are tough questions, and there's no easy answers. But they're questions we can't ignore. This is a whole new era of AI, and we need to be prepared.
Okay, so we've talked about the U.S., China, the whole global picture, even the ethics. But what about Taiwan? They seem stuck in the middle of this.
Taiwan's in a super delicate position. Their economy depends heavily on their semiconductor industry, and TSMC is their golden goose. But this deal could really hurt their relationship with China.
And they're already dealing with China claiming Taiwan as its own territory. This just adds fuel to the fire.
It does. TSMC is trying to walk a very fine line, but they might end up getting squeezed from both sides.
So not just a business deal, not just geopolitics, but also some serious ethical questions. This is a lot bigger than just chips.
It really is.
So is it a guaranteed win for the U.S.? Is this going to be a home run for the American economy?
It's not that simple. There are some potential downsides to think about.
Okay, like what?
Building these super advanced fabs, it needs a really skilled workforce. And right now, the U.S. doesn't have enough engineers and technicians with the right expertise.
So just having the factories isn't enough.
Right.
We need the people to run them.
The U.S. has to invest in education and training to get those skilled workers. Otherwise, they might end up with these cutting-edge factories, but nobody to operate them.
Imagine that. State-of-the-art facilities just sitting there collecting dust.
Exactly. And even if we solve the workforce problem, there's another risk.
What's that?
The U.S. becoming too dependent on just one company for its advanced chips, TSMC.
So we're trying to reduce reliance on other countries, but might end up relying too much on one specific company, even if it's now in the U.S.
That's the thing, yeah. It's risky, especially if things change between the U.S. and China, or if TSMC runs into its own problems.
It's a tough call. You want the tech, but you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. And definitely not a basket held by someone else.
It's a classic dilemma, trying to balance security with, well, with not being totally dependent on any one supplier.
And especially not a foreign one, right?
Right. Yeah, it's a delicate balance for sure.
Yeah.
And it actually ties into something even bigger, this whole idea of reshoring. Like countries are trying to bring manufacturing back home or, closer to allies.
Ooh, good point. We need to zoom out a little here, see the bigger picture. Like globalization is shifting, right? And this TSMC deal, that's one of the aftershocks.
A pretty big aftershock, I'd say. For decades, it was all about globalization. Companies wanted the cheapest places to make stuff, which was often in Asia, but that created these really complex supply chains, really vulnerable to disruptions, like we saw during the pandemic or all the geopolitical stuff lately.
Yeah, all those disruptions really showed us the downsides of having everything spread out all over the world.
Exactly. And now there's this pushback against that whole model. Countries want security, they want to be more resilient, not just efficiency.
So it's not just about being cheap anymore, it's about control.
Right. So now we're seeing this trend of reshoring, bringing production back home, or nearshoring, doing it closer to allies.
So instead of one big, interconnected global economy, we might end up with these regional blocks, each with its own supply chains, its own manufacturing hubs.
That's one possibility, yeah. And it raises a lot of questions, like would this mean higher prices for us, if things aren't made in the cheapest places anymore?
That's a worry for sure, especially with inflation being what it is. But, wouldn't it also create jobs here, like in the U.S., Europe, other developed countries, if manufacturing comes back?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the potential upside. We could see a huge resurgence of manufacturing jobs in those places. It's a trade-off, really.
And what about international relations? Imagine these distinct tech blocks, one led by the U.S., another by China. Wouldn't that change things?
Oh, yeah. Maybe more cooperation within those blocks, but also more competition between them. Maybe even friction.
Friction that could spill over into other areas, right?
Yeah.
Trade wars, military buildups, who knows?
Exactly. Lots of unknowns.
Makes you wonder what the world map will even look like in a decade or two. Will it be these regional economies, all interconnected, or something totally different?
That's the million-dollar question. And the answer depends on so many things. Economics, tech advancements, geopolitics. But one thing's for sure.
What the?
Semiconductors. They're going to be at the center of it all.
So we've come full circle, back to those tiny chips. Speaking of which, we were talking about AI ethics earlier. I want to go deeper on that. This TSMC deal, it could really speed up advancements in AI. But that raises some serious questions about how we manage this technology, right?
Absolutely. As AI gets more advanced and integrated into our lives, we can't ignore the ethical implications.
Okay, so what kinds of implications?
Think about potential biases in algorithms, the impact on privacy, the potential for misuse, like in surveillance or even those autonomous weapon systems.
Like giving a loaded gun to a toddler and just hoping for the best. We need rules, safety measures.
We do. We need guidelines and regulations to make sure AI is used responsibly and ethically.
But who sets those guidelines? Governments, corporations, international organizations, and how do you even enforce them globally?
It's a minefield, really. No easy answers. But they're questions we have to figure out. This is a new era of AI, and we need to be ready for it.
It's like we're at a crossroads, not just technologically, but ethically. This TSMC deal, this reshoring trend, it could reshape the world, but we don't know how it's going to play out.
It's a time of huge opportunity, but also huge risk. The choices we make in the next few years, they're going to be crucial.
So we've talked about the U.S., China, the global impact, even the ethical questions. But what about Taiwan? They're right in the middle of all this.
Taiwan's situation is incredibly delicate. Their economy depends on their semiconductor industry, and TSMC is the crown jewel. But this deal puts them in a tough spot. It could really hurt their relationship with China.
And make them more dependent on the U.S., right?
Right.
Not exactly a great position to be in.
Not really, no.
So what can they do? How do they navigate this?
They're already trying to diversify their economy, move away from relying so much on semiconductors. They're investing in renewable energy, biotech, other high-tech stuff.
Smart move. Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. And they're trying to strengthen their relationships with other countries, not just the U.S. and China, to gain more leverage, more options.
So hedging their bets, building relationships, trying to stay agile.
It's a smart strategy, yeah. But it's still a risky situation. Taiwan's future depends a lot on what happens between Washington and Beijing. And they don't have much control over that.
Okay, so lots of potential downsides, lots of risks. But let's not forget the potential upsides. If this TSMC investment actually works, what could it mean for the U.S., for the economy, for tech development?
If it works, this could completely transform the U.S. semiconductor industry. Thousands of high-paying jobs, a whole new ecosystem of innovation.
So a huge win for the U.S. economy, a boost to its tech industry.
Potentially, yeah. But we have to acknowledge the risks. We talked about relying too much on TSMC, maybe crowding out domestic innovation, and of course, the possibility of things getting even worse with China.
Right, right. All valid points. But there's one more downside we haven't discussed. It's a bit more subtle.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, I'm all ears. What is it?
It has to do with, well, innovation itself. One of the things that's made the U.S. so strong in tech is that startup culture. You know, always trying new things, taking risks.
Right, like Silicon Valley is all about disruption, thinking outside the box.
Yeah, exactly. But some people are worried that bringing in a giant like TSMC could actually stifle that.
How so?
TSMC, they're very structured, very process-driven.
So it's like introducing a big, slow-moving elephant into a herd of gazelles.
Perfect analogy. You might get some stability, but you could also lose that energy, that agility that makes the ecosystem work.
Right, right. So if all the smaller U.S. chip companies are struggling to compete with a giant like TSMC, especially with all the government support TSMC is getting,
it could slow down innovation. Less experimentation, fewer bold new ideas.
that's not what we want. The goal is to boost the U.S. chip industry, not stifle the very things that made it a leader in the first place.
It's a balancing act. We need those big companies that bring stability, expertise, but we also need the smaller players, the ones who are willing to take risks, to try crazy ideas.
Like a garden, right?
Yeah.
You need different kinds of plants to make it thrive.
Precisely. And that diversity isn't just important for the economy, it's important for national security, too.
Oh,
If the U.S. becomes too reliant on one company or one type of tech, it creates weaknesses. Adversaries could exploit that.
So back to that idea of resilience. A diverse, adaptable chip industry that can handle whatever the 21st century throws at us.
Exactly. And that means investing in more than just factories. We need research, development, education, and policies that encourage innovation across the board.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. From how chips are made, to global power dynamics, to the ethics of artificial intelligence. This TSMC deal, it's a big deal, and not just for techies.
It really shows you what's shaping the 21st century. Economics, technology, global politics, it's all connected. And like we've seen, there's no easy answers, no guarantees.
Right. But I want to leave our listeners with one last thought to ponder. What if all this huge investment, this attempt to change the chip industry and the global tech landscape, what if it just doesn't work?
That's the big question. If the U.S. spends billions and it doesn't work out, it could have serious consequences.
Okay, paint me a picture. Like, what would that look like?
They build the factories, but they can't find enough skilled workers. Or the technology becomes outdated before it's even up and running.
So billions wasted, we're still reliant on foreign chips, and China's probably feeling pretty smug about America's failure.
It's a real possibility, and it shows why we need a backup plan, a plan B. The U.S. needs to be thinking about winning this round, yes, but also building something that can last, something that can adapt and thrive no matter what happens.
Because this isn't just about circuits and silicon, it's about human ingenuity, about political strategy. And, well, let's face it, a lot of this is just plain unpredictable.
It's a fascinating time to be alive, that's for sure. The story of TSMC, the US, China, and the future of chips, it's far from over.
We might be at the beginning of a very long and very complicated story. Well, folks, that's it for our deep dive. We've explored a lot, but there's so much more to uncover as this story unfolds. So keep your eyes peeled, stay informed, because this is going to affect all of us in the years to come. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.